Hello and welcome to Power People and Planet. I'm Kumi, and this is a series of candid conversations with activists, community leaders, artists, and thinkers from around the world, which tackles some of the biggest challenges of our time. It is my sincere hope that you will find wisdom and knowledge here that will help you make decisions about where you put your energies in deciding how you want to make a difference to ensure that we live in a more just, more equitable, and more sustainable world for ourselves, for our children, and for their children. Natalia, thank you so much for being on Power People and Planet.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So you founded Coda Media in 2016. What made you create a media company of this nature? What was the purpose behind it? And what was the driving force?
You know, when I think back, there was one moment when I thought to myself very clearly, something's got to be done differently. And that moment for me was in the departures lounge of Sana'a International Airport in Yemen. It was in the midst of the Yemeni uprising. And I had 6 weeks earlier sort of smuggled myself into Yemen pretending to be a tourist. And I spent 6 weeks covering the uprising.
And you were at BBC then?
I was with the BBC. Yeah. I managed to get a visa and I was there on my own, but filing for television, for radio, and gathering stuff for a film that we put out later. And leaving 6 weeks later felt deeply wrong because I knew that no one would be replacing me. Not because the editors didn't care about what was happening in Yemen, and not because the story was over, because it was very much not over. It was simply because there was no longer any bandwidth. It would be too hard for anyone to get the story out without someone constantly lobbying for it and saying it must get on air. And it was so obvious to me that there was a structural problem with the way we were doing news, because it's designed entirely to amplify and promote the latest rather than the context, right? And the media creates the whole concept of breaking news.
Yes.
News doesn't break 24/7. It just doesn't. And yet we created this machine that we need to feed constantly because we believe it happens 24/7. And then the entire structure of journalism becomes like pegged to this machine that tells you like what's the latest update, update. And we're creating this just bottomless pit of pointless, disconnected updates. So what I thought to myself in that departures lounge of Sana'a Airport was very much, surely there is a way of doing it differently. People understand their lives in terms of stories and context. We all think in context, and yet news media today repeatedly fails to create context around the stories that they cover. The only way we can connect how the troubles of Yemenis are connected to, why British audience or American audience should care about what's happening in Yemen or what's happening in Sudan or what's happening in Ukraine. It shouldn't be because
one or two nationals of those countries died in the process. Yeah.
It's up to the journalist to say, this is why it's important. This is why you should care. But in the current media structures, we are not able to do that because all we value is what and when and the latest and the constant update and not the context, not the continuity.
I'm getting a sense, if you were to say the mission of Coda is to make sure that we challenge journalism to provide more the contextual reality of why certain things happen in the moment that we find ourselves in. But I'm sure it's more than that. Can you just elaborate?
The focus for the most media is what and when. And for us, it's really why and how. So we look at the underlying, right? We look at what's under the surface. We look at the themes rather than chronology. It's all about the root causes, right? So the mission is really to create context and continuity and not add to the noise, but add to the conversation. And also part of the mission is good storytelling, because a lot of really good journalism is wasted by really bad storytelling.
So in a long tradition in journalism, I remember even during the anti-apartheid struggle, journalists would say, we want to do a human interest story, right? We just want to interview you about what you do, what your context is, how you live, what's your daily thing. And to be honest, at that age, in my teenage years, I was like, oh my God, this sounds just like a waste of time, because I want to get the agenda and what policies and what the criticism of the government is and so on. And obviously, over the time, I've learned differently. Now, I want to hold up a mirror to you and ask for a reflection, right? What you describe about what Coda was experiencing in the early days, which drove your formation, which is the media world, in a way, erring towards reporting on the symptoms rather than reporting on root causes. I want to suggest to you that in a similar time that the people like you in the media were making this transition, it was also people in civil society, in the NGO world, in trade unions and the faith community and so on, were beginning to say, hey, if we look at a lot of what we call our activism, we are actually treating the symptoms of the problem and, trying to throw a lifeline to people to just pull them from the cliff of despair, if you want, and save lives. But actually, what is also needed on our side, just as you arrived at the same point, people in the NGO world were also arriving at the same point. We have to look at root causes. We need to understand the structural and systemic drivers of the challenges that we face. And it sounds, in that sense, there's some sort of convergence of what was happening in the community that you were working in and what was happening in the community that I was working in, which has been more on the civil society mobilization. That reflection sort of resonates with your observation of it?
Absolutely, because I think by then it was becoming very obvious that things were not working. And we are seeing the results of that not working today very
Absolutely.
clearly. But I think many of us saw it then, or many of us saw it even before that as well.
So in the early days, how did Coda try to respond to this specifically?
So what we wanted to experiment with, and our proof of concept was, we wanted to figure out, like, what happens if you take a thematic crisis and build the coverage around it and sort of use a theme to connect the dots. So me and my co-founder at the time ran a crowdfunding campaign and raised $30,000 to test our concept. And we wanted to do a story that people got wrong, that mainstream media did not serve well. And the story that we did was about the Russia and LGBTQ fight. And the reason that we picked that story was because, there was plenty of coverage by then. Sochi Olympics had happened. It was already established in the minds of Western audiences, who were our primary target, that Russia was a terrible place to be gay, man or woman. But no one had explained why. And we wanted to show that something was afoot with the Kremlin, that there was something on the agenda, that they were using that LGBTQ fight as like a front line for something bigger. So we did that story really before others did it. And now we know that LGBTQ plus rights are the front line of human rights and all of that. That was an insight at the time that people didn't have.
But wasn't it really more to distract people? I mean, this is a perspective that many hold, right? Yeah, and it's not dissimilar to the Republican right in the US. Of course, there are small minorities within, some would suggest, those in Russia and in the Republican right in the US, who genuinely hold these issues very dear, right? But it was
Yes.
used to distract people from a whole bunch of other things, like the economic injustices, the inequality that was rising.
I would say it was used for a much bigger thing than that. And I think that has paid off massively. The investigations and the coverage that we did showed very clearly the trajectory of the emergence of this homophobic rhetoric as a core pillar of modern day Putinist Russia. And what it was really all about was creating an enemy out of the West. Putin needed an outside enemy, and he needed to rally the troops. And we ran one story at the time when we were putting this package of stories together that talked about how in 2011 in Russia, and that was the moment when gay rights really became sort of a rallying cry, there were massive protests because the opposition, led by Alexei Navalny, now killed Russian opposition leader, was disputing the results of the Russian election. And there were tens and hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets of Moscow protesting against the government. And around the same time, a not very well known Russian Orthodox religious kind of oligarch brought a Christian relic from Greece to be displayed in Moscow in one of the cathedrals. And the line that formed around that cathedral to get in to see that Christian relic, it became Vladimir Putin's aha moment, right?
Uh-huh.
It was like, this is what we can use. And they built the entire campaign around the family values, around Russia as a state where it's possible to have a traditional family. And then our coverage also showed how well and how smartly they adopted that narrative to different countries where they worked, whether it was working later on with the far right groups in the United States that this resonated with, and the Christian groups, or in Georgia or Central Asia, where societies are much more traditional and it resonates. And that whole kind of narratives also needed an enemy, and the gay men and women became the enemy. And we saw how gradually the anti-LGBTQ narrative and this whole like family values thing just became part of the authoritarian playbook, from Hungary to, Bolsonaro's Brazil. Like, it was
Yep.
incredible. During the 2020, during COVID, Bolsonaro spoke in, like, he literally repeated word to word phrases that we were tracking on Russian state television in 2015 and 2016. It was a particular myth that WHO was trying to enforce masturbation among children. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but it was first said by some random expert, in quotation marks, on the Russian TV. And then it was picked up, and suddenly 8 years later, it's repeated by the Brazilian president, right? As part of a much bigger attack on WHO, which became a much bigger attack on institutions of Western liberal democracies, which systematically were not working by then, we knew, as well as we wanted
So
them to.
in 2019, you're just reminding me, I was doing the closing address at the Skull World Forum in Oxford, and I suggested that Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Orban, the Crown Prince of Saudi, and a few others were probably on the same WhatsApp group sharing strategies about how to message this thing, and also how to, by 2019, really about how to exercise full control and repression. So from the time that you started in 2016 with Coda in a world already in decline on ensuring that we had genuine media diversity, if you want, how did your work change, you think, since 2016 to the present moment? Because the whole world has shifted in such fundamental ways. And, Trump was elected for his first term in 2016 and so on. So just give me a sense of, if you were to look at what drove the formation of Coda in 2016 and the media landscape then, and what's different about the media landscape now, right? And factor in the Elon Musk Twitter X reality, the fact that Mark Zuckerberg now is also aligning to the Trump agenda.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way. My sense is that things have got substantially worse from the moment in 2016 when you started till now.
I would say two things have changed. One is that the stories that were very marginal then became very mainstream now, right? Like, it is now a truism that Facebook doesn't care about truth. At that time, when we were doing stories about what allows the Putin and Modi and Bolsonaros of this world to have that metaphorical WhatsApp group, is the technology that is created here in Silicon Valley. Ultimately, that's what puts everything on steroids. The information ecosystem that is created in Silicon Valley is ultimately designed to advance authoritarian agendas, because it's designed to advance the noise and the autocrats of this world have learned very well that noise is the most wonderful tool of censorship that any autocrat has ever been given. So, before Steve Bannon said flood the zone, Putin was flooding the zone. Like
Anyway.
that's like a well-tested Russian tactic. So, that is one thing that changed. And another thing, we're constantly moving as well, right? At Coda, we're constantly trying not to be the slave to the news cycle, because when you're a slave to the news cycle, when you're covering who said what, you're basically following someone else's agenda. What we're trying to do is do journalism that is proactive and not reactive, that is setting the agenda rather than following someone else's. Like once the New York Times is on any story that we've covered before, and that happens to us all the time, then like there is no point in us being on it. We'll never compete. So we're always moving on. And the second thing that changed massively and very rapidly in the last few years is that the way we as a society consume the information has changed fundamentally. And we are seeing that change happen in real time now with AI. So we are constantly thinking about like what it means for us and the way we tell stories and how do we tell them.
One of the real goals of the podcast right now is to redefine what is activism and who is an activist, right? And so I want to put it to you that when you describe what you and your colleagues are trying to do, that you all are trying to address one of the biggest things that holds back social change for positive progress, which is not actually the repressive state apparatus, even though the repressive state apparatus, when it
100%.
manifests itself, gets all
Yep.
the attention, because there's torture, people are getting killed, and it's in your face, and it's understandable. But actually, the bigger form of control that we are suffering with is the ideological state apparatus, where the framework for the communications and media is absolutely critical. So in that context, one of the things I would like to suggest is that the work that you are doing with your colleagues in Coda and other people in this community is actually the most important kind of activism that we actually need today, which is to challenge the way that misinformation and disinformation has just run rampant, right? So in that sense, do you think embracing the term activist poses, what problems does it pose, if any? Does that venture down the myth of objectivity and so on?
I think about it a lot. And obviously, I came up in journalism in an institution where it's been drilled into me that activism isn't what we do. And I believe that activism isn't what we journalists do. But at the same time, I know that the biggest impact that you can have is change. The best thing that's happened to me was when, because of the reporting that I did in Myanmar during Cyclone Nargis in 2008, the UN got into the country and saved real life. That's great, right? It's a real change that we want. And like, what's the point of putting words out there if you're not changing? Like, then it's not journalism. So I think we have a different place in the society than activists do. And it's really important for journalists to continue to campaign only on behalf of that thing that we're rapidly losing, which is truth, because journalism is desperately needed in the times when we're increasingly all live in our bespoke realities. Because I can't think of another discipline that is more suited for being the translator between the bridges, being the bridge between the echo chambers. Journalists have always managed to translate different realities to people on both sides. I was raised in a journalistic tradition where I was always told that somebody's terrorist is somebody else's freedom fighter. That ability to operate in that gray zone is incredibly important. So the minute that we start campaigning on behalf of someone else, then we lose that ability. And so it's not so much about the objectivity, it's more about the acceptance that different opinions exist and different lives are informed by different experiences. And my job as a journalist is to really try to understand opposing points of view and come at them with an empathetic stand. But at the same time, we as a journalism industry, we need to rethink who our allies are. We need to seriously reconsider who we're getting into bed with. we need to get to the bottom of some of the structural issues. We need to hold up a mirror to ourselves and say that we are at least partially responsible for, massively responsible for what's happening in the world today. I spent sort of past year really trying to answer that question of, like, in this modern age of AI advances that are completely changing everything about the way we live, we marry, we have a relationship, we vote, we have sex, like everything. AI is truly changing everything. And it's shoving us further and further into these bubbles that we're already in. Like, what is a role of journalism? And unless we are brave enough to create new alliances and say, you know what? Yes, if this work helps this activist, then I can and I will do this work. So activism, just like journalism, I think they have adjacent roles in the society. And neither you nor I will survive in a truly authoritarian society. And the whole world, humanity is headed towards authoritarianism.
Yeah,
right?
Because one of the things as Secretary General of Amnesty International and in other roles that I've had to embrace over the last 15 years or so is standing up in defense of journalists who are being killed and thrown in prison and so on. So parts of, from our end, seeking the truth means seeking the protection of people who can tell the truth. So I'm not really particularly concerned about the actual names that people embrace, that, like whether you call yourself an activist or not is less important to me. What is important is the way that you described it actually at the end, that we need to understand where the intersectionality is between where your world stops and our world starts. And there's no question today, given the centralization of the ownership of media, because I mean, if you look at how difficult things are when you have a Facebook and a ex-Twitter that is explicitly now in the hands of one political party.
Absolutely.
Right? And then also look at state-owned media in places like Russia and elsewhere. I mean, I was in Russia in 2006 and was interviewed by a radio station, which we're very proud to say we are not a state-controlled media station. And then when I eventually got there and did the interview, and the interview was fine and nothing too obviously controlling, but I was railing about fossil fuels is 85% of the problem of climate change and so on. And I said, so actually then if you're not state control, who owns it? And the guy smiles and says, Gazprom, which is the state-owned energy company, right?
That's great.
Which is basically so the narrowing and for example in the West, I mean, Rupert Murdoch probably is one of the most powerful people in the world by far, many times over. I mean, he determines who's going to win UK elections. Tony Blair had to do a deal with him to get a chance that the Labour could return after years of them supporting the Conservative Party. So I think this is a kind of tricky kind of area, because I personally don't want journalists or the journalistic community more broadly to kowtow to activism, because in a way we need the journalistic community to hold up a mirror to activism to say, hey guys, you all say you're against racism, but when I look at your structure, you're very structurally racist. You all say you're about gender equity, but when I look at your leadership, so we need that. We need that.
Yeah,
right?
and we need to preserve the journalist's role and enhance the role of journalists as bridge builders, right, in these communities. And, like, I believe in a woman's right to have an abortion. There is no question. I will never join an anti-abortion protest because I feel that I shouldn't, because that will undermine my ability to talk to people who do not want women to have abortions, including women, right? For possibly legitimate reasons, or to understand them and to create some sort of a conversation between the two.
The common meeting point of the broad world of activism and the broad world of media and journalism is around three rights, and that is the freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and also the freedom of association. You know, the
Absolutely.
right for journalists to organize as journalists in associations that defend the rights of journalists and so on. I want to shift a little bit the conversation now to, you have seen so many different resistance strategies to injustices in all different parts of the world and efforts to advance for positive change, even though you probably saw things moving more in the other direction more than seeing positive progress in a positive direction. But what is the sort of more, if you want, quieter forms of resistance or invisible forms of resistance, or things that are not called resistance at all, you know, such as storytelling, such as the use of arts and culture to communicate? And I know that you've been associated with the ZEG Festival in
Yeah. So we started ZEG in 2019 very much as part of our attempt to create the new alliances, right? We didn't want to have a journalist festival because that frankly sounded really boring. But we wanted to bring people. I really believe in, that the future is really cross-disciplinary. I think we are all too much in our silos, including professional silos. We all need to get out. So we wanted to figure out, like, what happens if you put a ballerina and a philosopher in the same room to talk about war, right? Like, mix up the conversations, because I think, and I'm not going to say this is it. ZEG is not about resistance, but ZEG is, the festival has grown a lot since 2019, and it's recommended to everyone. It's very fun in addition to everything else. And, I look at it personally as journalism, because it is about bringing people out of their silos and their echo chambers and creating the conversations and coming up with new ideas. And it is for the audiences who come to us, who are a very important part of the festival itself. And for me, we have a responsibility, and it goes back to your question about, like, what is the resistance? We have a responsibility to use one of the greatest gifts that we have, which is the gift of imagination.
absolutely.
And we have to imagine what we want this world to look like and figure out how we build it together and who we want to build it with. And we need to come together in new ways to celebrate things that work and find new ways to carry on and reasons to carry on, because there are plenty, right? One of the great failures of liberal democracy is that ultimately it failed to reimagine the old colonial structures that were so fraught. And it was built on that without properly restructuring them.
So I'm just really struck by the similarities in your journey and my journey, even though our focuses are quite different, right? And even our intellectual impulses, are different starting points. Because I am saying exactly what you're saying today, that what is missing is actually a pathetic, absence of imagination, that many people have come to accept that the world that we live in is the best that humanity can create for itself. And I just refuse to accept that, as seemingly you as well. And so then it takes me to, well, one of the reasons why I have embraced in the last couple of years the power of arts and culture to help us to break down silos, to help build bridges, to also celebrate difference. Because basically, I very much, this is not necessarily everybody in the activist community would say this, but I very much think that our democracies and our societies are stronger when people disagree fundamentally with each other, can actually have respectful, humane conversations where we understand each other and understand why, in fact, people feel so strongly when there are differences. And our challenge is for us to reach points on many issues, including on LGBTIQ, on gender equality, on many things where maybe the facts and the scientific facts are not so crystal clear as with climate change, that where we agree to disagree respectfully, right? And that we don't have to kill each other, we don't have to demonize each other, and so on, because we're seeing the rearing of fascism, and fascism actually wants to accentuate divisions and make everything black and white. And to be fair to Trump and the current wave, there've been lots of elements of this thinking that have been bubbling for a long time. When George Bush said after 9/11, you're either with us or against us, the
absolutely.
othering and belonging stuff was very much there. So where does the power of arts and culture lie in your reading? And put it this way, my view is that harnessing the power of arts and culture alone will not deliver us salvation from the climate crisis and the intersecting crises, but failure to harness the power of arts and culture to communicate to a much larger number of people, to open up more respectful conversations across different opinions and so on. If we don't do that, we'll fail. But doing that alone obviously doesn't provide it. How does that?
It sits very well because it's very much informs what we're trying to do with ZEG, but actually also with Coda. Like we work with artists a lot. We do a lot of animation. And it's really important because, there are two things here and they're related. One is in order for us to keep making the world a better place, whatever that better is, the conversation needs to get off online. We don't have spaces online where a constructive conversation is currently possible because the algorithms that run these systems are designed for hatred and violence.
Yeah.
I started covering the war in Ukraine in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. And it was incredible to me to watch how in the beginning, when I would be going to Crimea and I would be going to Eastern Ukraine and spending time in Donetsk, there were two things happening in parallel realities. There was a war on Russian television. If you turned on Russian state television, you would see things being bombed and children being abducted. And it was all fake because none of it was really happening when you were there in the city. The Russians would be saying, oh, the city of Slavyansk is on fire. And I'd be sitting in Slavyansk and nothing was on fire, right? But I watched how that projected reality, they manifested it. It moved from the TV screens into the reality.
Yeah.
And in July of the following year, I stood in the field of sunflowers surrounded by bodies that fell out of the sky when Russians shut down MH17 plane with 289 passengers, including 80 children. The most overwhelming feeling was like, how did we get, how did this fake war, how did that hatred that existed on social media and on Russian state television ended up in these children still strapped in their airplane seats in the middle of a field in Ukraine? And this is what we need to stop. It does not have to end this way, right?
Yes.
We have a responsibility to make sure that that hatred and that violence doesn't translate into more hatred and more violence that happens in real life. But we can't have this conversation online because the platforms that are created here in Silicon Valley are designed to promote virality. Our solution is we're trying to scale it and we're working to scale it, and it's possible to scale it, but it's real face-to-face stuff.
So basically, it's, if you have to put it in, we look at social mobilization historically, it was very much door-to-door, face-to-face, community organizing, and so on. And quite frankly, that resonates completely with me. The only way you can break through this if you are building a sense of community. And another problem we have because of the noise factor, so much of BS being poured on top of people, is that you're also seeing a global mental health crisis as a result of it.
Absolutely.
Right? And therefore, if you think about how do we respond to that on scale, I would argue that actually one of the best responses is to actually create multiple opportunities for people to participate in public life, whether it's painting a mural in the township or the community where they live, running maths classes for kids who are struggling. These are all things that historically had lots of presence and resonance in terms of communities.
Yeah.
And so in a way, that is part of the solution, right? Maybe harnessing and deploying the power of arts and culture?
Yeah, absolutely. The great paradox of today is the fact that we live in the world that is filled with information, but where we lack understanding and we have all the content, but we don't have meaning. Nowhere does understanding and meaning more powerfully than arts and culture. Arts and culture are like a really important front line of the authoritarian wave and rise. I think the allies are those who are also threatened by this changing consumption habits and information, and the way we consume information. Like everything that has to do with context and depth is threatened by virality and by social. And if you think about it, there is an incredible flattening that is happening on a massive scale of everything, right?
Flattening.
Flattening. Like
Is
everything
this
is
dumbing
becoming
down or is it something else?
no, like it's just like everything is becoming much more of a template. Like Instagram has templates for cool videos, but at the end they all look the same because it's
Aha.
the same template.
Okay.
And this is what then further kills our ability
To
to
imagine.
practice imagination
Yeah.
and to imagine. So we don't need to say no. Like these are wonderful tools of convenience. I'm holding up my phones.
Yeah.
These are great and we don't need to say no to them. But solutions to this world are not going to come from the devices that are run by a bunch of really rich guys who are getting richer and richer.
Absolutely. Now, I want to do some quick fire questions, right?
Okay.
So you said recently that journalism has become the problem it's trying to solve. I think you've covered that, but can you just summarize in a few sentences what do you mean by that?
The media industry is a huge part of the problem that all of us face today. There is a reason why fewer and fewer people believe the media because we take stuff out of context and we cover everything that happens around the world, and there are amazing journalists everywhere. And I love my colleagues. I'm deeply dedicated to this profession, but the industry itself has just become a bottomless pit of updates. Instead of giving people meaning, we just add to the noise. There is a lot of noise.
Okay. And of course, I would add that what makes it difficult for many journalists to actually be their true selves and to fulfill what they were trained to do is very restrictive editorial policies, depending whether you are state controlled or corporate
Oh,
controlled.
no, absolutely.
And, one of the things that really stands out has been the reporting on the Israeli Palestinian conflict over the last year. Of course, we know that there have been many journalists within BBC and elsewhere who have privately and sometimes publicly expressed the pain that they've suffered because essentially they've had to exercise bias. So, what would, in your estimation, given the current state of play, right, what would be a more effective, impactful global journalism ecosystem, and what would that look like? And how can our audience, with this podcast and elsewhere, help push journalism in that direction?
I see a lot of hunger for meaning, for substance in our audiences. I really believe in the wisdom of the crowds and the people. They're turning their back on something that isn't working. And there is, in some ways, it's also a great time to be a journalist. And if you're doing it in a different way, I really hope that maybe one thing that will be good about AI advances is that more and more news will be automated. And there will be increasingly sort of the distinction between news, which is like, here's the latest, like a robot can do it, and journalism, which is this is what you need to know to understand what's really going on. These are two very different things. We do the journalism, not the news.
Thank you. My last question is, if you had to write an article for the audience of this podcast, how might you approach it in hopes of moving them from pessimism to action? Because one of the things that I'm finding myself saying in every space that I'm in the moment of history, we find ourselves, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, lived experience, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism, of our thought, our creativity, our action, our sense of humanity. So, but specifically for, this audience, how, from a journalist's point of view and a media landscape point of view, what would be the key things you would say to them?
I think about it a lot because, like everyone else, I zone out of the news and I find myself depressed at times, and I try to figure out, like, what do we do? One of the reasons why we do ZEG, which by the way means the day after tomorrow in Georgian, is because I find incredible inspiration when I get offline and when I meet people and when I learn about things that they're doing, right? And that's what I loved about being a reporter, because it was amazing to go to really faraway places and meet really random people I would otherwise never meet, and have the license to ask them questions and be inspired by the humanity and its many different iterations. And I think that still very much stands. So there is a lot of both hope and inspiration we can find in our fellow humans. I also draw personally a lot of optimism in my own country's history, because it's very much defined, like it has survived centuries and centuries of oppression. It has been colonized and taken over by every power right around the world. And it's still a place where people never lost their ability to have a lot of joy. And a lot of that joy comes from resistance. There is real fun in a fight. And the fight itself, the process itself, is sometimes more important than the destination. And it's not the end point. We will never achieve the perfect world. It will always be filled
Sure.
with people who we will never agree with.
Yeah.
But it's more important than ever to figure out what it is that you believe in and what the values are, and who are other people, your allies, who have the same values, and then stick with them and be in this fight with them.
Natalia Antelava, thank you so much for joining Power, People and Planet. And thank you for all that you've done in your life, all that you continue to do, and all that you will do in the future. And I'm sure that your work is going to have groundbreaking influence. Keep up at it, keep pushing us, and stay safe while you do all of this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you found this podcast useful, please follow us on social media, share the links to people who might be interested, and write us a review wherever you get your podcasts. This goes a long way to keep the podcast running. I send you a lot of love, courage, encouragement, and I urge you to always say to yourself, the world would be a much more bleaker place were it not for people like you who are willing to resist the idea that the world we live in is the best that humanity can create for itself. Of course, the world we need to live in needs to be much better, much more just, much more sustainable, much more fair than the one that we live in. Until next time, thank you so much for joining Power, People and Planet.